Hey guys, Bugcat7 here. Okay, it is Friday, May 2nd, 2025, and I'd like to thank you for visiting the Stonewall Research 2 channel here on YouTube. I really do appreciate it. Thank you very much. And if you're a new subscriber or somebody just stumbling on this channel, I do have another channel, my original channel, the Stonewall Research channel, which is still here on YouTube, and I have something like 400 and something videos on that channel for anybody to look at if they care to look at that. But, a lot of the same type of research is done here as done there. So, it's just a continuation. And I strongly encourage people to watch some of the videos on my channel. I go through the giants, quote unquote giants, state by state, and then internationally as well. Various accounts from all the states in the United States and from all the Americas and from all of Europe and Asia and all everywhere on this planet. So I put together a compilation of those things on my channel. We have the states one in a playlist. So you have to look for the international ones. And then I also go over some of the myths and legends of the giants on that channel as well. So this video has, something to do with that, and very much has everything to do with what we would consider myths and legends. But, again, many researchers today, mainstream researchers, are, starting to reevaluate a lot of myths and legends into, what the real components of those myths and legends might be. They have their sneaky suspicions that, there's a bit of truth to these myths and legends, but what is it has to be sort of deciphered from it. So, and, I attempt to do these things on this channel with respect to what the real story of the whole giant timeline is up until, historical times, from ancient times and historical times. So, this video is about the Jack from Jack and the Beanstalk and the Jack from Jack the Giant Killer, who are, if you didn't know it, are the very same Jack. So, basically one was a homicidal juvenile delinquent, and the other guy is just sort of a cold-blooded, tricky killer, of the giants. And, it basically, in my opinion, from all the research that I've done on the giants, I've done quite a bit on this channel. I haven't read everything, and I'd like to read a lot more on it, especially from Jason Jarrell and Sarah Farmer, and also Collins there from Lithuania. He talks about the hybrids, and this is something that Harry Hubbard was kind enough to straighten me out about, because when we're talking about the unearthing of these large skeletal remains that are like 8 and 9 feet, 10 feet tall, these are basically the hybrids. Okay, Harry Hubbard sort of straightened me out, because he was like, I don't think they're the giants until they're like 15 feet, 14, 15 feet and taller. So, he's talking about in the timeline of the giants, when these were the original giants, they hadn't mixed DNA quite yet, because of the timeline of events that occurred probably through the late Pleistocene and early Holocene that we don't know about. But they're obviously they couldn't come out of nowhere. Although the way the historical accounts are of these people, they seem to come out of nowhere. So they believe this and they believe that. It's apparently you know some of these peoples were doing the same things as peoples in America, the Americans were doing. But in any case, this is mainly about the stories about Jack and the Beanstalk and Jack the Giant Killer, and if you didn't know they were related to each other, I mean, obviously this is not a hard thing to find out. So this is, basically what the AI says on it here. Yes, Jack the Beanstalk and Jack the Giant Killer are closely related, often seen as variations of the same story. Jack and the Beanstalk is a more familiar and generally less violent version, although somebody dies, the giant dies, so that's less violent, I guess. I don't know how this gradation works here, but in any case, while Jack the Giant Killer is a more archaic and potentially darker version featuring a more aggressive Jack. So here's a more detailed estimate. Both stories feature a young hero named Jack who confronts a giant. The giant often steals or holds something valuable like gold or treasure that Jack seeks to retrieve. So, let me just go over what I think, this whole thing is about here, okay? At some point in the past, there was this giant genocide going on, all over the world, maybe at different times, but in far ancient times, because there's evidence of it. So, in probably in more later times, the Lovelock Cave people, and, if you didn't know, and I think a lot of people who have watched my channel have gone over to Lovelock Cave any number of times because it's such a baloney story from top to bottom is what we're given about it. But they weren't just people who lived in a couple of giants or a family of giants who lived in a cave or something like that. The Lovelock people were a people who lived in the area. And I guess, in close proximity adjacent to the Paiutes who were also in the area at the same time. And so, what they did is they harassed these people, attacked them, or whatever it was, because let's face it, you know, we're more agile than the giants. The giants, like as Harvey Hubbard describes, the real giants of real antiquity. The ones are antediluvian giants and of the like are far, far taller individuals. And, the ones, we're talking about in much later times are these hybrids that, evidently hybrid with any number of other kind of humanoid species that were wandering around at the time on this planet, which is the story that we're not getting. But, we have accounts of it in, historical times, especially Cabeza de Vaca. So, this is, these were like the last vestiges of these people who apparently were, all of them weren't killed off because we have the Frisian people who had that history of being tall and, unusual skeletal anatomy, which they can't figure out. Okay, so, they apparently made it through all these millennia and whatnot, but and we have the stories of the Algonquins with the good giants. So, it's this whole story, this is aside from the whole Bible story, other than the fact that the Bible was trying to tell us something about creating these hybrids was not a wise idea. With the angels having, relations with, human women, which he couldn't have been. Maybe the angels were, could be any sex or whatever, but it seems highly unlikely that a giant individual could mate with a average sized female person like us, because how's a lady going to carry like a 30-pound baby? It just ain't gonna happen. But the other way around, it could happen. Giant lady with regular sized guy. That could happen. So that's probably what it was talking about. But, you know, this is why we had to make up all sorts of stories about cannibalism and many, many other things. So, here are these stories in far later times. And these are talking about the last vestiges of these people being systematically eradicated in these areas because they're just incompatible. Again, I just give as a sort of, you know, demonstration about how, let's say, the giants were still around today, and here's your 12-year-old kid at the bus stop, your average size 12-year-old kid, 5 foot tall or something like that, and here he's at the bus stop with this, 6 foot tall 12-year-old, whatever, what's going to happen when they get into a fight. So we probably decided at some point in the past that were just incompatible with it. But there were some of these people left in these areas and left, isolated and alienated by us. And, this is the kind of things that happened in the Americas here as we took over the Americas here from the native peoples here and, basically killed off most of the tribe with just a few individuals left. As is, told by, the history of Thomas Jefferson coming up here to Long Island to record languages and only found a few individuals left from some tribe that was up here, and they could barely speak their own language because they didn't practice it anymore. They spoke English. But so in any case, these were these last people who were left. So let's think about it a little bit. Okay, so if you were one of these giants, who its history there is how these all us average sized people eradicated most of your people in the not too distant past, going further back in time, but this and you want to harass them and intimidate them. So what, they come and kill you off too? I mean, unless you're talking about senile old giants who just don't care anymore. But I mean, I could see where they'd be driven, be so alienated that, and cut off from everywhere, that where are they going to get food from? Where, if they're starving, maybe they're able to provide for themselves, but like everybody, especially in those times, who needs help, they got it from the church and everything, but, where did these giants get it from? Nowhere. So, they were probably alienated. And again, many of these stories, they're living on mountains. So just keep that in mind. All about mountains all the time. Where are these giants living on? Mountains, So Jack and the Beanstalk are living in some castle in the sky. That's the mountain there, as, related to Jack the Giant Killer as opposed to Jack and the Beanstalk. But most of the legends of the giants in Europe, especially, most of these giants were always, the legendary giants were always living in the mountains. Always. And always with tests of strength with large stones all the time and playing around with stones all the time and whatnot. So, and rock and boulders and all this kind of stuff. Just again and again, stories about them like that. But, okay, so what did Jack and the Beanstalk do? So the earliest story is Jack Spraggins and the Magic Bean, where that's the earliest recorded story, but apparently it goes back thousands of years. It's not the first story. It's the first written story of it, but the historical context is it goes back thousands of years, if you didn't know. So it says here the fairy tale Jack and the Beanstalk has deep roots, with evidence suggesting its origins may trace back over 5,000 years to the Proto-Indo-European period. Early written versions appeared in the 18th century, but the story's core narrative and themes likely existed long before that. Okay, so Here's the ancient origins explanation here. Researchers at Durham University and Universidad Nova de Lisboa have traced the story's roots to a Proto-Indo-European narrative form, which is now classified as whatever, the boy who stole ogre's treasure. This suggests the story existed in various forms across different cultures and languages long before it was written down in English. So, okay, so the thing that catches me here is the ogre's treasures. So these ogres and giants have treasures. Okay, so it's just making me think about how the dynamics of the Adena society was and how it also compares to the Watusi tribe in Africa up until they were dissolved somewhere in the 1960s. And I have to read an article from 1964 about the end of the Watusi people there and what happened there and what the dynamics were between them and the Hutu people there. But this was going on in the ancient past where, evidently, like, the Adena people were the ruling class and had all these treasures and everything else. So these stories handed down over the centuries about the ogre's treasure, etc., etc. Well, that makes a lot of sense from that sort of perspective, from her realistic historical perspective. You see, that makes a lot of sense to me. And similarly, that would apply to the Belviker people as well as the Brighton Winter Cave suggests. Okay, which seems to be another story about these giant genocides. It's just funny how it's so similar to the Lovelock Cave people. They sort of light a fire at the entrance of the cave, and basically all the people all the oxygen in the cave's eaten up, and all the people suffocate inside there who are hiding from you for some reason. Okay, this incompatibility issue, I'm sure, but that's the same story over there. Apparently, is a preferred way of getting rid of these people. So, in any case, we'll have to explore more of that New York Times article about the Watusi, the demise of the Watusi from 1964. So, in any case, this story's been going on for quite some time about these over some 5,000 years. So 5,000 years, it's taking this amount of time because we know of these large humanoid type people in historical times from all the accounts. But in these cases, these are the hybrid peoples, as uh, Collins refers to there from Megalithomania there about these hybrid people. And Harry Hubbard, made it clear that, that's what we're talking about here. We're talking about 8 and 9 footers. So, all right. So Jack here with Jack Spraggins with the magic bean went up there. So this is the original story, apparently, about Jack and the Beanstalk, or one of the original stories of Jack and the Beanstalk. There was no golden harp and golden goose and money and all bags of money and all this kind of stuff. That was all added later on. The story morphed into other stories and whatnot, but the end result was the demise of the giant, of course, and the pilfering of all his riches there. But, the original story was just go up there and antagonize him, you know, and okay, so you got some kid who comes on your property. Did they have like the giant police back then? Could the giant call the cops and say, hey, there's some kid's coming on my property and it looks like he wants to get inside my house? I don't know where he came from. He climbed up some kind of beanstalk or something like that. So is that what's going on there or whatever? What does Jack have a right to bust into the Giants' place there and take anything from her or harass him or anything like that? Okay, but it's interesting. Later stories are that as you go up the Beanstalk, there were actually like plateaus where there were like inns and villages and stuff like that. And the Jack marries, and then this is from some of the things that I believe Tolkien took from mythology here, where they had a ring that if they put this ring on and faced it to the north. Okay, this is the story here. Okay, so Jack up on his way up the Beanstalk there is like a travels of his, up to be taking a long time there and stopping at these inns and towns and everything along the way. And then he marries, right? And they go up to the giant's, palace or house up there in the clouds there. And if he wears this ring, he acquires this ring where if he points it north, he'll have a enjoyable time with the giant up there. How, it's not explained or anything like that, but the giant still says the fee fi fo fum thing to them anyway, and he's gonna grind their bones up, live or dead, and have them as some soup or a sandwich or something like that. But if they have the ring on, then they're going to be entertained. That's what's said in the legend. So they could either be entertained or eaten or something like that, or whatever it might be. But who are these people harassing these giants? Like, it reminds me of like the story about how they found the giant in the cave in Kandahar in Afghanistan. Somebody found an actual giant. This was the report that went around, or the whatever kind of junk that went out there. And, some of our guys, some of our boys there from the U.S. there went in there. They found the giant there, and he had like a shield and a spear, and he was attacking them or whatever. So they machine gunned him down or whatever it is. And people like, L.A. Marzulli and a couple other guys were like, yeah, that's great. Now we have a giant. They have, the military has possession of a giant. It's great. It's great that, that fellow, whoever he was, might have had a family or something like that. Maybe he was a real giant from the underworld or something like that. Who knows? But, the guy probably had a family, a mother, a wife, kids. Who knows? You know what I mean? He killed this guy. Like, yeah, that's great. Really? And so now you got a giant, or you never see, nobody reports it, well, whatever, kind of baloney story, but kind of reminds me of that. You know what I mean? That, just, hey, go ahead and kill him or whatever, it's fine. So we have the Jack and the Beanstalk story, and Jack the Giant Killer story more or less goes like, some giant that was alienated from the mainland and living off the mainland there is coming and stealing all the cattle and, I guess probably trying to eat something. They have them isolated there. What else would you do if you were starving over there? Being kept isolated away from other people and whatnot. And they got rid of these people just like they did here in the Americas, just like here on Long Island when the religious groups got here and they wandered around Long Island, and they got either cooperation from the native people, and the ones that they didn't get cooperation from, they just killed them all. That's all. Okay, so I'm sure there's a similar thing going on then. Okay, because when the current British population got there, with Brutus's gang there, with the Giants of Albion there, those were the indigenous people there, these Giants of Albion. Okay, where are the Giants of Albion? Yeah. Let's see this for a second in Ancient Origins. I kind of like this picture here because it says in this picture here, Albina and other daughters of Dionysius, two giants of Albion are in the background, encountered by a ship carrying Brutus and his men. Okay, so this is from this library or whatever it is, but check out the giants over here. Are they wearing like animal furs? And they got that kind of weird Middle Ages depiction stance there. You know, that if I could stand up and do for you, I'd do for you because it looks kind of weird. But they'll stand there and look like they're dressed just as good as the people who are coming here to see them here. But apparently, Brutus's guy there had to have a wrestling match with them and kill the main one there. What's his name? The Giants of Albion. This is, I forget the guy's name. So, in any case, just another story about killing off the Giants. So that's what they did when they got here. Is they killed off the Giants. So these are stories of Jack and the Beanstalk and Jack the Giant Killer. Are just the elimination of the pockets of them that were around the British Isles at the time. They just had to get rid of them. Even St. Patrick was busy doing it over there himself. Okay, getting rid of the Giants over there. So, what's Jack and the Giant Killer stories. Okay, so they got rid of it. He got rid of the guy who was stealing all the cattle and whatnot. They got rid of that guy. Then he came upon in the mountainous region a palace of these two giants. So they locked him up, but somehow he got a hold of some cord or something like that and made some slip knots and slipped it around their two necks. There's two giants there, and he slipped it around their neck somehow through trickery there. And it was attached to the iron bars at the back of his cell there, and the slip knots choked them both to death, and he got out because he got the keys from them. They were right there. Okay, so then from there, he went to Wales and knocked on a door of some guy who needed a place to stay, and it was this giant, this Welsh giant, who let him in and said, "Yeah, you could stay in this room over here." And so he stayed in the room, and he didn't go to sleep because he was nervous, and he heard the giant outside his room mumbling something about eating him or whatever it is. But the giant didn't eat him. He just, when the morning came, he woke up and the guy gave him some breakfast and whatnot. And, the guy didn't eat him, and he gave him some breakfast, and somehow there was a trick there with the breakfast there. He made it appear again or whatever it is, and a magician, and that mesmerized the giant. And while the giant was mesmerized, he killed him. So then from there, he went somewhere else, like down by the water. There was a giant sitting on something down by the water over there, and he stabbed him in the back. Okay, it just seemed that, wherever he went, then he went to a palace somewhere else there, and there was a giant dragging a knight and his wife there by their hair somewhere, and he, with a very sharp sword, he cut off the giant's legs and then cut off the giant's head. So, who knows what the guy and his wife maybe did something. Who knows what's going on? He doesn't know anything. He's just going around killing giants, whether they deserved it or not, stabbing them in the back, killing them even though they granted the guy hospital. Who knows what the giant was mumbling outside his room or whatever. Maybe he's saying something, to the contrary, but just involved the conversation. But who knows? But whatever, he killed him anyway. So, because that's what you had to do to the giants. See, that's what the story is all about. It's about the eradication of the last vestiges of the giant hybrid giants that were left around the world everywhere. This was going on everywhere, including here in America, although many of the hybrid chieftains were still around in historical times, as we know from historical accounts, that named this or that chief, who were witnessed in real life to be of unusual stature. And as I've gone through this with the history of height, right, that the Native American people in the plains here in the Americas here were among the tallest people in the world in 1800. So And average height today is five, almost 5'8". And if you go through all the countries, and I have on average height, like the tallest people are come from like the Black Sea area. But it's interesting to me that these people, they are almost every single one of these is at 5 foot whatever, 5 foot 11 in some taller cases. This goes by country, average height by country. And it's just interesting to me that all of these people in the Dinaric Alps here tower above all of these people at 6.5 foot tall. Most of these people are, much under that. But where's the Dinaric Alps? Okay, so the Dinarides are a mountain range in southern and south central Europe, separating the continental Balkan Peninsula from the Adriatic Sea. They stretch from Italy in the northwest through Slovenia, Croatia, Bosnia and Herzegovina, Serbia, Montenegro, and Kosovo to Albania in the southeast. And if you see all the average heights for people from these countries, they're also very tall as well. But specifically in the Dinaric Alps, okay, so let me just refer to you all the myths and tales of the giants, especially from Europe, where these giant legends were living in the mountains. Okay? Alright? So, here's some sort of, indirect evidence of really tall people living in the mountains. Well, here they are in real life, okay, but 6 foot, 6.5, it's saying 6.5 foot. So, okay, so that would be an unusual height since the average height is 5'8". Okay, why would that be for these people living in just the Dinaric Alps? They had to isolate this one area, okay, to get the average height of these people who live in these alpine places. Well, some of my relatives came from. My grandfather was 6'5", and all his sisters were like 6'2", 6'3". He had like 3 sisters that were all like huge. But so that's what these stories are about. And Jack, who's the same Jack evidently from what we can gather, so this Jack guy is just, one of the guys who went around killing all the last vestiges of giants based on the, ancient, I guess, practice of doing this, from the times of the Bible, when we know from the story of Joshua and the people in Canaan over there, that he went in that city over there and killed all the people there and their children and their pets and everything, their animals and everything else, to kill everybody there. Okay, but without getting into that, just there's going to be people, I'm sure, many skeptics are going to say, well, there's no such thing as giants, and so all these stories are ridiculous and whatnot. Okay, so there really isn't any story, there really isn't any real giants to be found in Britain. Well, I beg to differ with that. Okay, so look, you have the stories of the Albion giants, right, before the people who was living there. Well, it's clear to me that the Belbeaker people were living there. Okay? So, this is from Wikipedia about the Belbeaker people in the British Isles. A study by Wald et al. 2018 confirmed a massive population turnover in Western Europe associated with the Belbeaker culture. In Britain, the spread of the Belbeaker culture introduced high levels of steppe-related ancestry and was associated with the replacement of 90% of the gene pool within a few hundred years. British beaker-associated individuals showed strong similarities to Central European beaker-associated individuals in their genetic profile. Both men and women with steppe ancestry participated in turnover in Neolithic Britain, as evidenced by the rise of the paternal haplogroup, blah, 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 and maternal haplogroup. So, the study also found that the Bell beagle arrivals in Neolithic Britain had significantly higher genetic variants associated with light skin and eye pigmentation than the local population, but low frequencies of the SNP associated with lactase persistence in modern Europeans. So, I guess, with these people, steppe people come, with the drinking of milk and dairy and all kind of stuff, which is typical for these people who are, sort of cattle people and horsemen and all kind of stuff. Strontium and oxygen isotope analysis of the Aylesbury Archer dating from 2300 BC, the richest burial in Britain in this period, found that he spent his childhood in Central Europe, probably in the region of the Alps. So we're really just talking about the Alps. Okay, so what, who are these Bell beaker people? Again, I've gone over this many times on my old channel and including this channel, okay? So let's just take a close look at their cousins, according to Jason Jarrell and Sarah Farmer, who are researchers, wrote this book, Ages of the Giants, which I've never gotten. I really want to get it and read it. Okay, so these models here of the Adena, as compared to an average size human, okay, are based on the measurements taken or recorded by the Bureau of Ethnology at the Smithsonian of the Adena excavations, archaeological excavations. So they're not based on some, imagination or something like that of somebody. They're based on the average size of the skeletal remains that were found and recorded and reported in the report by the Bureau, the annual report from the Bureau of Ethnology, which they later integrated with the Smithsonian. When the weird Smithsonian came about by the guy who never went to America, had nothing to do with America, but wanted to have a museum there about America for some reason. But, okay, so these are the cousins. The Bell beaker people are the cousins of the Adena through their skeletal anatomy. Okay, so, what is their skeletal anatomy? And again, I've gone over it so many times on this channel. Historical craniometric studies found that the beaker people appeared to be of a different physical type than those earlier populations in the same geographic areas. They were described as tall, heavy-boned, and brachycephalic. Okay? Okay, so the early studies on the beakers, which were based on the analysis of their skeletal remains, were craniometric. Okay? And here's what it says at the end here. Margaret Cox and Simon Mays, some physician, they're talking about the migration theory. Okay, so that's how these Bell beaker people arrived in these places, because they don't have any historical backup that goes further back in these areas these people had to come from somewhere else. But if they came from somewhere else, then the British people came. Was there other people there before the Bell beaker people got there? So here's many, many questions to what was going on there. But so here's what the position. Although it can hardly be said that craniometric data provide an unequivocal answer to the problem of the Beaker folk, the balance of the evidence with that president seemed to favor a migration hypothesis. Because where do these people come from? Okay, but this is the problem of the Beaker folk, the craniometric data, because this is how they trace their movement throughout Europe, because only these people have this skull type, these vaulted craniums, and the Adena do as well. Their skeletal anatomy is almost identical, and they're slightly smaller than these Adena people. So, I mean, if you're skeptical about any of these legends being possibly have some validity or truth to them, well, I'm sorry to inform you that this is what's going on at the time where these stories would be being told. Okay? And here are some actual reports from Britain of these giant people found. Several reports and historical accounts document the discovery of giant skeletal remains in Britain, often associated with myths and legends, including the giant skeleton of the Glastonbury giant, while some finds, like the skeletons found at Brock in Scotland, have been verified and are believed to be from individuals with exceptional height. Others, like the 21-foot tall giant found in Northland, are more speculative and based on historical accounts. One source suggests that giant skeletal remains, even in the 21st century, what does it say here? Still baffle scientists. Still baffle scientists. So, I forget that guy's name from Skeptic Magazine or whatever, and the other guy who writes for Skeptic Magazine, and he's so skeptical about the giants and all kind of stuff like that. Well, what is mainstream science saying here, bud? They're still baffled? Okay, what are you baffled about? We're all supposed to be one species, right? So, what's to be baffled about? Well, this clearly indicates that we aren't one species, you see? That's what's baffling about it. Okay? There's no reason for it. Okay? They baffle scientists. Meanwhile, I read to you so many times on these tabloid science articles, when they dig up these giant remains, their job now is to categorize it as gigantism. Every one of these skeletal remains will have gigantism, even though many of the skeletal remains found of the Adena and these Belviga people were much thicker bone. You can see the ligaments, where the ligaments attach to the bone because it leaves some kind of impression on the bone. All right, that these people were powerful. They weren't just long and skinny, similar to the Watusi people, who, by the way, in that article in the New York Times, described them as long and lanky with pointed heads, small and pointed heads. I guess, they weren't ashamed about saying it. It was the last of these people, and apparently violent political struggle over there. But how did the Watusi get these spindly heads and all that kind of stuff? So, did they practice cranial deformation? Did the Watusi practice cranial deformation? No, there is no evidence that they did. But if I show you pictures of them, you'll say, hey, they have elongated skulls. Okay, but they didn't practice cranial deformation, see? All right, so another interesting thing about the Watusi there. But in any case, guys, okay, so is it hard to believe the story of Jack the Giant Killer? Well, hardly. It came to a point in Britain sometime in the ancient past. At the time, some of these stories supposed to be taking place, at the time of King Arthur, for example, despite the fact that they say it goes back to far ancient times. It's just a retelling of the same story, the same excuses to, and, Don't think, I'm doing this from any sort of like woke perspective. Oh, the poor giants who are cannibals, according to the Bible and according to L.A. Marzulli, every single one of them were. And, when they recount their accounts, well, they say, and, all over the world that the giants were cannibals. Yes, they were using the same demonization of the enemy that was used against giants and anybody else. See, that's what L.A. Marzulli leaves out when he recounts the stories of the giants and stuff. He doesn't tell that part of it. And every single, anthropologist that studies these things knows that. Okay, so it's just a demonization of the enemy there to get rid of all these people. We were incompatible with them. We probably killed them off down to almost the last man, and somebody survived. Maybe they felt sorry for them. They let these people live and do it until they became a nuisance or whatever, like it recounts in Jack the Giant Killer, and then they had to be killed off. That seems to be the theme, around the world. Okay, similar to that in many, many other stories and historical accounts, because, they wanted to get rid of it. They certainly very quickly got rid of all the native peoples here on Long Island, which apparently were the offspring of King Mongatuxi, or Long Knife. And every time I hear Long Knife, it makes me think of William A. Ritchie, the head archaeologist of New York State, back when much of the data was gathered of the archaeology of New York State. And he would always find these oversized knives and harpoons that no average man could handle repeatedly in burials around New York State, although no skeletal remains were found, although so many accounts of skeletal remains, once being exposed to the air, turned to dust as they oxidized instantly. They hadn't seen, they were buried in moist soils and all kind of stuff. And when they finally saw air, they all broke down, many of them, except for the skull, which is always very hard, and the teeth and everything. And again, with the perfect teeth. I'm just saying, what were these people's diets in the ancient past? So we could talk about that anytime, but this is what Jack in the Beanstalk and Jack the Giant Killer is recalling. It's the eradication of the last vestiges of these people. Did they deserve to die? Hard to say, but it seems that at one time the dynamic was that these larger peoples, including the Bellbeaker people, who had a similar system going on, the Brighton Winter Caves, fully demonstrates that, except that different from the Lovelock people, the Brighton Winter giants had their subjects, their loyal subjects with them, similar to that schism that probably went on there, as well as went on when the end of the Adena Hopewell culture came to an end, because the Iroquois were more or less forced to migrate to New York. But the Cherokee people, which spoke an Iroquoian language that was sort of far removed from, what we know as Iroquoian here in New York State, in the Northeast, here in Canada, etc. But still, from an Iroquoian language, the Cherokee people who stayed in these areas that the Iroquois migrated from, clearly evidence of some schism going on where, it's raining heavily outside. So where these, giants were. So in any case, that's why I really want to go over that New York Times article about the Watusi because he described the dynamic that was going on, sort of feudal system that the Watusi had with the Hutu people there, who were just of average size, where many of the Watusi people were of considerable large stature and 7 foot and taller in some cases. All right, as I showed in my other channel from the travel film, I think I showed it on this channel not too long ago too. Travel film about them. So in any case, Jack from Jack and the Beanstalk and Jack the Giant Killer is just some sort of juvenile homicidal maniac and just an older homicidal maniac running around killing the giants for any reason. It didn't matter. They needed to get rid of them. It came that time, and this is what is recounting that story. And again, the denial of these things having any sort of truth to them. Well, I'm sorry, but you have the Bell Beaker people there in Britain, okay, at a time where this evidently was long before the current people got to Britain there. So you can deny it all you want, but this is, the size of the people that were there. So there were giants there. Okay? Quote unquote. The unscientific name for them. And it's used purposely on either side to either, exaggerate it or minimize it from a skeptical point of view. That's why I repeatedly say large humanoids, people of large stature. As soon as you use the word giant, people are thinking about the Jolly Green Giant and all that kind of stuff. So it's raining very, very hard here right now. So, in any case, guys, ooh, lightning too. So, guys, think about it. Think about the stories about Jack and the Beanstalk and Jack the Giant Killer. It's really about the eradication of the last vestiges of the giants, some holdouts, and could have been lone individuals. And you're telling some sort of truth about it here. Telling about how, it came a time where these people who were incompatible with us, we could not live with them, had to be eradicated by us. And being that we're more agile, that somebody is going to be, maybe somebody of large stature is going to be stronger and able to wield a larger weapon, let's say, or something like that. In our gravity, somebody that big is going to be far slower than somebody of average size. It's going to be extremely agile. So, by comparison, if there was a whole tribe of, Andre the Giants or something like that, we would have a major advantage against somebody like that because we're far more agile people. The most, energetic, prize fights, in boxing and everything are the featherweights and welterweights, where the heavyweight fights is like fights in slow motion almost, by comparison. So we're very agile, and we got rid of the giants in most places on this planet, other than places where the hybrids were already integrated into the population, or some of these last vestiges of them integrated with other peoples in the areas. And it seems to me like that's DNA scientist said, the Denisovin guy, who's the expert researcher, said that we're an amalgamation of hundreds of different humanoids from the past. In his opinion, most likely, that's because when they look at our DNA, it looks like from like hundreds of different sources that are all pieced together. Nobody has pure DNA. See, that's the whole thing about it. Nobody on this planet has pure DNA. It's all mixed up with all kinds of other DNAs from other people's everywhere. And, many they're not sure of, like the ghost DNA in African peoples. What ghost DNA? Is ghost DNA? Okay, so they dug every square inch of this planet up. Do they really know where the Bell Beaker people come from? It just so happens that in ancient times, the people in the Americas were migrating all over the place and up and down and all kind of stuff, migrating up instead of down, and all this kind of stuff was going on. So similar migrations taking place, and probably a similarity or maybe even one culture or related cultures. That's what it seems to be. And even surprise, surprise, it probably the Israelites, the Hebrews, that came out of Egypt there, who originally came from the land of Canaan, right? With their ancient Hebrew being exactly, absolutely 100% identical to Phoenician. Their alphabet is 100% identical Phoenician. How much you want to bet that the Phoenicians were of large stature? Because when Joshua had to kill all those guys, where they no, they said they were up in the hills, but I think that's more closer to the seashore. And the one city that they sent him to was closer to the sea there, first, where all the giants were there. So those were the ancestors of the Phoenicians there. Those giant people there, seems to me. And they had to get rid of them there too. They knew already back then of the incompatibility. And if you were a believer in the Bible and everything, then you would believe that the giants came from this illegitimate union between angels and average human women. So, in any case, guys, that's what the real story is about, okay? Many people are going to say it's all myths and all kind of stuff. Were they? Based on the fact that we know that the Bell Beaker people were there in Britain prior to the current peoples reaching there. Okay? This is in like 2800 BC we're talking about with the Bell Beaker people. Okay? Alright, so really are they myths and legends, or really recounting a myth, or is there sort of truth to it? And I say there is. This is what went on all over this planet. We don't like weird people, us average size humanoids, whatever humanoids were derived from. This average size one. We're not the miniature ones, and we're not the huge ones, although, as it turns out, in my opinion, the reason why we stopped growing is we weren't really growing to begin with. Between 1800 and the early 20th century, we really weren't growing. It was that this is the end of the integration of the larger people that were above average size from all over the world, like these people in the Alps there, okay? The Dinaric Alps, right? But the guy there in Britain supposedly came from when they examined his DNA and all kind of stuff. Okay, so are these really myths, guys, or is this recounting a story of what we did as a species, or a hybrid species? Because we're not an original species. We're some kind of subspecies. Most human beings are some kind of subspecies. And so, did we, get rid of all these people? Did they need to be? How sophisticated? Apparently, the Bell Beaker people were very sophisticated with their pottery and their earthen constructions. Apparently, you have to know what you're doing. It's not just dirt. It's engineered soil. It's not just buckets of dirt. Okay, there's all kinds of mixtures in there to make these mounds last forever. Okay, they knew what they were doing. And the design of these things are absolutely amazing on huge fossil lands like the Adena, 30 acres or something like that. And they make a perfectly round earthen mound circle. How's that happen? Okay, in primitive times without surveyor equipment and all kind of stuff. How do you do that? So, in any case, and passing on the most sophisticated sort of set of laws to the Iroquois, the big man, the great peacemaker, you know, was, one of these Adena, and the Iroquois had to run from the Ohio Valley because the Cherokee were there. And they were probably the lowest class of people in the Hopewell society. And they rebelled against the giants. They didn't want to be slaves anymore. And sort of feudal system that might have been going on there. And, they put an end to the Adena and the Iroquois, who are actually the Hopewell. They know full well that they are now mainstream academics, that they had to run. They couldn't stay there with the Cherokee after this political schism happened in their society after 1,000 years or something like that. So, in any case, guys, think about these myths here as being sort of partial truths about what happened to the giant peoples, the people of large stature who had the, unfortunate, demise there through, the incompatibility and probably a lot of built-in societal prejudices that were, the giants